Book Club, and we're thrilled that you're taking a bit of time out of our crazy lives these days to invest in yourself, invest in being better, invest in this amazing book that I hope you enjoyed reading. If you haven't read it, I hope you will enjoy this discussion and get a chance to read it. And we have an amazing group of people here to discuss that, including you. Before we get into all that, for those of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself. As I mentioned, my name is Chris Dorbeck. I'm the former editor of Federal Computer Week, back in the day when they printed magazines. I know it's some of us have to dig back deep in our memories. I was the afternoon guy at Federal News Radio here in Washington, D.C. I now do a blog and podcast on GovLoop called GovLoop's Dorbeck Insider, where we focus on 6 words, helping government do its job better, and also writing a book on how to do, well, how to moderate, because we've all sat through those sessions where it feels like Harry Potter Dementors are sucking all joy out of the room. The working title of my book is Moderators Matter, because I believe that moderators can make a difference, and you can let me know how well I do. Links to me and the Dorbeck Insider and all that kind of stuff can be found at cdorbeck.com. I also want to take a moment to talk about AFFIRM, the Association of Federal Information Resource Managers. AFFIRM is a nonprofit, volunteer educational organization with the goal of improving the management of information through technology with the federal government. And it is a 40th year of AFFIRM this year. In the spirit of AFFIRM's charter, we have raised and contributed over $250,000 to date for high school and college scholarships, and we're very proud of that. We'd like to thank all of our volunteers for the hard work they do on programs and pulling together to support government even during these challenging times. AFFIRM has proven to be the little engine that could. We've been able to pivot during our mission using technology to do things like this that help you do your job better. I will note that we have some amazing, awesome events coming up. You'll see them on the screen. Later this month, we're going to talk about how COVID has shattered the myths of government management. Sounds cool. And we're putting together a program on FITARA for September. And in October, on October 8th, AFFIRM is working with the US Cyber Challenge on the 7th Annual Cybersecurity Summit as we look at the evolving threat landscape. It's changed a lot over this past couple of years. We extend our sincere thanks to AFFIRM's sustaining partners. Their logos are included in acknowledgement and in appreciation for their support in these challenging times. They are particularly challenging for nonprofit organizations like this one, and so we thank all the sustaining partners for making this all possible. With that, let me also introduce the rest of our book club group. Nancy Koehn, she is a historian with the Harvard Business School and author of our aforementioned book, Forged in Crisis, The Making of 5 Courageous Leaders. Also joining us is our AFFIRM's esteemed president, Jackie Rubino. She is by day, she's executive director of Strategic Programs Division for the Department of Homeland Security. And as I mentioned, she also serves as the AFFIRM president this year. Thrilled to have you here, Jackie. And Jay Huey. Jay is currently doing God's work. He's the Chief Information Officer at the DC Office of the State Superintendent of Education right here in Washington, DC. He has served in a number of federal jobs as well, covering cloud and all sorts of cool stuff. So 2 of the brightest people that I know to help discuss this book. They are here. You are also here, and I thank you for that. You are an essential part of this discussion. Those of you who have been with me when I moderate, you know I value discussion, dialogue, and this is particularly true today. If you have anything to share, please do not be shy. Jackie and Jay are here because I know them particularly, and I know they are very thoughtful and have been just troopers in terms of reading this book and sharing parts of it. But also you share what touched you about this book. As we discuss, be sure to share your ideas. And with that, let me go through the questions. You can use the chat function to ask questions. Just open the Q&A tab right on the webinar toolbar and type in your questions. You can also see other questions that people have asked, and you can give them a thumbs up if you think that's a great question. You can also use the raise your hand function, and I can actually invite you to join as part of the discussion. You can ask your question yourself, so don't be shy. Technical problems, if you have any, the amazing Rebecca, who is part of the AFFIRM team, she will be there to get it all fixed. Just click on the help button or whatever it says there. And there will be a survey at the end. I know people sometimes don't fill those out because you think no one looks at them. I look at everyone. So, and if, in fact, if you have a great book that you think would make for a good book discussion, let me know that too. Finally, if you miss anything, by signing up, we will send you an on-demand version of this discussion, and we will send it right to the email you used to register. All right, Becca, did I get everything? Are we all good to go? I think so. Let's get into this amazing book. As I've mentioned to people, this forum is kind of like the Oprah Book Club, but our books are a little bit more wonky. And they focus on my favorite 6 words: helping government do its job better. And we're so lucky to have authors like Professor Koehn and these smart government executives to chat about it. I told Professor Koehn that I first read this book when it was released in 2017. I was in the midst of my own time of darkness, and this book was really very empowering for me. So I'm thrilled that we get to talk about it in these times which are so challenging, and we're all sick of the term unprecedented. With that, let me bring in Professor Koehn, author of Forged in Crisis. And Professor, I kind of wanted to start there because I do a lot of moderating, and inevitably when I'm moderating, somebody says, oh, you know what we need is more leadership. I don't think we actually always know what leadership is, and then is it something that is formed? And it's one of the things that I took last time when I was reading this, but it particularly resonated when I was reading it again this time, is what leadership means and how it applies. Is this a learned skill?
It's definitely a learned skill. So I know, I can say this with great confidence, having studied leaders past and present for 25 years. Leaders are made, they're not born. It's not a DNA endowment. And they come in all shapes and sizes. They're made. But they're made by conscious intention on the part of the individual to get better, to learn from, particularly from disappointments or crises or crucibles. Difficulties teach us more than easy moments.
Yeah.
But we're made, and it's a lifelong process. And the thing about this book, for those of you that haven't read it, it's a story of 5 leaders from different times, with one exception. Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln live in the same time. But it's a story of 5 individuals, different contexts, different missions, different, zip codes, so to speak. And they're all confronted with a massive slow burn. So it's like COVID, slow burn crisis that they didn't see coming. And so what do they do? How do they respond to that? How are they forged in crisis, first from the inside out? And then how does that impact, that what's happening to them affect their external agency, their external impact? So they're made. It's the story of their making, and why that making is so important for a worthy mission, and also what we can learn from that making. So leaders are made. The second thing I want to say about getting our hands around this slippery and all too, cavalierly used term leadership is to offer you a definition that I stumbled on many years ago. It's in the opening pages of the book, but I think it bears repeating here. And it's from a writer, not from a general or a president or a CEO or an activist. It's from a writer named David Foster Wallace. And here's the definition. It's from an article he wrote in 2000 when he was a reporter for Rolling Stone covering the first John McCain presidential campaign. And he wrote, real leaders, courageous leaders, are individuals who help us overcome the limitations of our own weaknesses, selfishness, laziness, and fears, and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. Just think about that for a second. Leaders are individuals who help us push through boundaries of laziness, selfishness, weakness, fears, get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. I think this captures a great deal about effective leaders. And I think these are people who do this and take us on a path to a better place. But in order to get to the better place, we actually have to break through these boundaries and work together to do that. So that's a slightly long-winded answer to.
No, it's perfect. And it's funny that you mentioned that. It's funny that you mentioned that quote, because I sent it out to the AFFIRM board today, this morning, saying, oh my goodness, this is just what a great definition, and captures it so well, I think. Talk about these 5 people. Why these 5 people in particular, and what do you take away in synopsis form? But is there a big takeaway from each of them?
So the individuals are Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer. This, incidentally, if you're interested in this background, is a replica of the lifeboat, the James Cairn. He and 5 crewmates, expedition mates, sailed to seek rescue in the spring of 1916 through an almost impossible boat journey. But Ernest Shackleton, the explorer, who made the impossible possible by rescuing 28 of them in this incredible adventure survival story. Abraham Lincoln, whose 4 years in the White House is just one slow burn crisis with he sitting at the center of the darn storm. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave and then abolitionist, who I would suggest to you is one of the most important leaders in the 19th century, and without whom, and his work and his activism and his extraordinary commitment to ending slavery, a 20 years commitment that after the end of the Civil War would be transferred to getting women the right to vote. Without that commitment, Lincoln could never have issued the Emancipation Proclamation, never gotten through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were his original work. So Shackleton, Lincoln, Douglass, and then the fourth story is a gentleman that many Americans have never heard of, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a minister, a Lutheran minister born to very well-connected German parents who came of age in Berlin as the Nazis were taking power and became very early on a resistor against the Nazis. He and other family members, actually. I mean, it's this extraordinary story of both his faith and how he tethers that or anchors that, uses as an anchor to really fight this extraordinary tightening noose of evil. And then the last story is Rachel Carson, who, again, not so well known to current generations of Americans. She wrote a book in 1962, which I would suggest to you is the most important book published in English in the 20th century in this country, called Silent Spring. And more than any other single person, Al Gore will tell you this, Bill McKibben will tell you this, all kinds of really smart, accomplished environmentalists will tell you this, more than any other single person launched the environmental movement back in 1962, all this while battling metastasizing cancer. So extraordinary people. I did not choose them, Christopher, they chose me. So there's an element in which this book isn't really my book. It's really, I somehow got to be like a channel to do, I'm a good historian. I'm a rigorous, serious researcher. I've been doing this a long time. I know my craft. So I had the work of getting the stories right in terms of what happened and who they became and telling this emotional inside out story, but they lived the lives. This is their story. It's not my story. They lived these lives so bravely. They kept getting better. They kept getting off their knees. And they were forged in crisis. And they've taught me a lot about living through crises, including dividends I never expected to see because I didn't see COVID coming. None of us did.
Well, and that's what because this COVID period, I know you're talking a lot about this book right now because a lot of people are saying, hey, crisis, how often have we heard the term unprecedented these days? We're sick of the word unprecedented. And yet the stories that you read in here, I mean, they redefine unprecedented, right? What are the lessons that we can learn in these unprecedented COVID times that these people teach us?
Okay, so let me just try and offer one, like you said a minute ago, from each person. So I think, and there's many of them. By the way, each chapter has woven into the story these things they stumbled on and then why they might be useful to you today. So just to take Ernest Shackleton, for example, managed in a crisis, the leader has to manage the morale of his team, of his followers. Right? Think about Andrew Cuomo in his daily press briefings. There's a lot of business being done, a lot of logistical hurdles, a lot of numbers, et cetera. And then there's a huge piece of like literally managing the morale and the behavior of New Yorkers. And he's still doing that, like way out from the heat of the thick of the storm.
Yeah.
So manage the morale, keep your fingers on the pulse and manage the morale, which includes everything from energy to the intangible resources that people don't even know they have, like staying together, being united, being disciplined. This is really true of COVID. It was really true on the ice in 1914, are incredibly important resources that we can summon up if a leader asks us to do something harder, better than we can get ourselves to do on our own. So manage the morale, manage the energy, recognize that you're much more effective. The whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. Unity is critical. The lesson from Lincoln is, there's many lessons from Lincoln. Perhaps the most important lesson from Lincoln is that that anchoring yourself in the mission, right? And saying, this is, he didn't create the Civil War. He didn't want the Civil War. He found himself in that, that old adage, when God wants to punish you, he answers your prayers, right? He wanted to be president. He didn't want to be president during the Civil War. But Lincoln's message to us is, when you find the worthy mission, right, a worthy mission, then you can rise to accomplish it in a crisis, right? He said in 1862, right, the dogmas of think about this with COVID, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must act anew and think anew. So Lincoln tells us when you have a big worthy mission, you act anew and think anew, and you rise as a person and a leader in order to get that mission accomplished, even in the most difficult circumstances. And you can see it when you read this chapter. You can see him digging deep over and over again in that mission, first to save the Union. And then once the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, and he realizes that there's a bigger, much more moral mission at stake to transform that Union into one that lives true to the promise of America that all men, and today would say all women, are created equal. So find your mission. You know, it is extremely important, and it can help you rise first inside yourself and then for the rest of the world. The lesson from Frederick Douglass is simply never give up. Like, he is a story of extraordinary resilience, extraordinary perseverance. And our kids all need to read the story of Frederick Douglass. And all those 20 somethings who don't think that there's any risk to COVID need to read about Frederick Douglass and realize you persevere on hard stuff because it's good for you and it's good for the community. And there's a big deal at stake in doing that. And,
and I'm just going to pause you there for 2 seconds, because we always in government talk about how risk averse the government is. And I mean, the amount of times that he failed and was like up against, I mean, over and over again. And I mean, my goodness, didn't give up. Like, the tenacity and tenaciousness was just incredible.
You know, if you choose, and if the folks in our virtual meeting room here choose, we can certainly talk some more about resilience. I've learned a lot about it, both the research and the more modern research and the embodiment of it. But that resilience, the ability to, which by the way gets you strengthened, it's a muscle. Resilience is a muscle. Once you find it and access it, we all have it. Once you access it, it actually gets easier to get over the next obstacle. But this idea that, you know, this is something hard because it's important and it's good. It matters. And if it had been easy, it would already be here. So Douglass, it teaches us that. Bonhoeffer, I think, teaches us, and this is going to sound a little bit distinct from these other messages, but it's incredibly important. It's the end of the epilogue to the chapter I write. Bonhoeffer's leadership, which has many, many different footprints, even today, even though the Nazis, right? You know, even though he didn't stop the Nazis. But his biggest message or takeaway is leading your life thoughtfully, decently, compassionately, right? With a great sense of your interdependence with other people is a form of important, magnificent leadership unto itself. Mm-hmm. So he teaches that literally how we show up every day, right? And what standards we hold ourselves to, right, are important acts of leadership unto themselves. And you can just go on social media for 30 seconds and look at the baseness and the grossness out there and imagine what we are each doing by choosing not to engage in that, by choosing to offer ourselves and our kindness and our tenderness and our courage to others, right? So that lesson is incredibly important today. He's if you've never heard of this man, you need to read this chapter.
I hadn't before I read it. And
he's just astounding.
Remarkable.
When you read it, because the growth in this person is so inspiring.
Well, and we'll come back to him on courage, because he left Germany and then went back at a time when this felt like just a death sentence. Absolutely. I mean, that's, but as I say, we'll come back to that later, but go on to...
well, let's come back to courage if we might, right? Because I know it's something you're interested in. We're all interested in it right now. And these people have taught me something about it. It's certainly not the absence of fear, just to give you a little teaser. Right. And I think Rachel Carson teaches us, this is important for all kinds of introverts in the room like myself, that leaders come in all shapes and sizes. So she's a quiet, shy, soft, retiring person. She was that way as a young girl, and she's that way as the biggest, most influential author, right, in 1962, when Kennedy uses her book as a reason to set up the first of what will become a series of very powerful environmental hearings on pesticides in Congress, and really starts rocking and rolling on environmental action. She's soft, she's shy, she's retiring. She prefers walking along the beaches, looking for marine wildlife or life to walking the halls of power, even though she rose to the level of 18 in government. She was a federal employee for a long time, working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. But she teaches us that a shy, retiring person who isn't charismatic, who isn't aggressive, who isn't a public speaker, can be as powerful as any president. So I want every young girl in America, just like they're looking at Kamala Harris and going, I can be that. You can be Rachel Carson. You can be Kamala Harris. You can spread your wings and be who you want to be. It's not about these typically male characteristics that we've kind of projected onto great leadership. So great leaders come in all shapes and sizes.
Let me bring in Jackie Rubino and Jay Huey. You guys, either one of you want to go? In fact, Jackie, I'll start with you. Parts of the book that touched you particularly of these 5 people, was there one of them that you just particularly went, woo, yeah, I can take something from that. It speaks to me.
Well, definitely Shackleton. They all spoke to me in various ways. I would say I found it tremendous that Bonhoeffer and Douglass both had to make a big decision and be, when we get into the conversation about courage, both actually go back to a place where their lives were at risk, or, they made a decision for their cause and stood by it. But really what resonated with me was Shackleton with his men, certain decisions he would make about putting the men before himself and never letting them see his fear or his stress about what was going on. Their ship was being consumed by the ice, and the men didn't know that, right? And so that really was huge for me.
Think of the self-discipline and forbearance, right? The idea that you show up for your followers, especially in a crisis, right? Confident, right? Caring, but not an emotional heap, right? You may be a hot mess, but Shackleton, as Jackie was saying, and all leaders understand this. You can't use your people as your therapist or your release valve. You simply can't, because they need to believe that they can do harder, better things, right? As they follow you, and they can't believe that if they're your therapist.
Well, and I was thinking about that, and I'm sure Jackie and Jay face this all the time, where we're really in a time of almost trauma, right? And how do you empower the people you're leading to feel, okay, yeah, this is a traumatic, there is stuff going on, but we're bigger than this, and we're bigger than this. Each of them talk about that in very different ways. And what skill is that gives people that empowerment? The empower to empower, I guess.
You folks, I'm not a leader, I'm just a scholar of leaders. Jackie, you lead.
It's, with Shackleton again, another thing that resonated well was he took the naysayers with him when he had to separate from the team. And so he really was able to remove kind of those cancers and those people who had, would cause that mission to fail. And that's true. I see that in, government. I've had to find the right position or the right effort for some of the naysayers to lead. And then they've become shining stars in the organization. And that was very impactful.
Right. And critical to managing morale, right? When you have a team, like to your point, Chris, how you empower other people. Well, you don't want the doubting Thomases spreading contagion among the team that's then going to go try and empower and inspire other people. And so Shackleton, like a lot of leaders, right, Lincoln did this all the time, kept his friends close and his enemies much closer, right? Or as Lyndon Johnson once said in his inimical poetry, better to have them inside the tent peeing out than outside the tent peeing in. So that is really important. It's a really important piece of morale and a really important piece of leading your people, right? Is how you deal with the naysayers.
Jay, what particularly touched you?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a book I got Monday and honestly finished Wednesday. It is amazing.
I love you.
Yes. And, I see a lot of leaders I know on the attendees, so hello, and it is totally worth that. There are many threads in everyone's life that I think resonate, but I was really inspired by the connections across. They all suffer not just one adversity, but many. And I think about that in the IT space. Most shops can survive one failure, but can you do 2, 3, or 4, that cascading series of issues? And I think fundamentally what they all show is this ability to frame. Frederick Douglass does it in a shockingly overt sense in his 4th of July speech where he said that. Lincoln does it in a much more subtle speech in Gettysburg, where he says, we need to, we the living consecrate the ground of the dead here. Rachel does it when she reframes like sort of man's relationship with nature. It's this act of framing and the trust that has to happen from the team. So, for me, it's that perspective. And then also, absolutely, many of these leaders are lonely, get lonely. And to the professor's point, like you sometimes can't let them see you sweat. You got to be the duck with the feet paddling furiously, but they all built themselves kind of a support structure. Shackleton had like his sergeant major.
Frank Wild, yep.
Right, thank you. Lincoln had his 2 secretaries as well as his wife. I mean, there's so many ways in which Dietrich had his family and sort of his church, in a literal sense. So, you have to know when you're griping and problem solving, and to whom, I think was again, a question of framing so that people don't take you at your word all the time.
Mm.
And just to pick up that, these are brilliant pullouts from both of you. So thank you. I'm honored. It warms the cockles of an author's heart, especially when I spent like 15 years writing the book. It was a long pregnancy. But just 2 follow-ups. I think your point is, I never thought quite so explicitly, Jay, about framing. They all frame. And then that's very important to how they help people do harder, better things than they would get themselves to do on their own. Follow. It's basically the frame, right? Gettysburg Address is a great frame, but they all framed. You're absolutely right. And they also, so I'm just reinforcing what you said or thanking you for it. And then the other thing that they did was, to your point, is they found ways to recover, right? So they, part of recovery was releasing, right, with Frank Wild, if you're the trusted context, the trusted places, the trusted people, that a leader can release their doubts or their fears or just sometimes despair, and then go right outside back in the pond and paddle furiously, but appear calm and headed in a certain direction. They all did that. And then last but not least, I feel like one of the things this book taught me, as a channel rather than a creative author, was that being lonely is, first of all, part of leadership. So if you can't take it for 5 minutes and you're not allowed, you can't be alone and feel like no one understands the burdens I have, or I don't have someone I can release this privileged information to, or right now it's on me. If you don't understand that and can't stand that, you're in the wrong field of endeavor. Stop trying to lead, because leadership, like the human condition, but perhaps at certain moments more intently, has these pockets of loneliness. So what do you do with them? That's the interesting question. Not fighting them. What do you do with them? I mean, Lincoln did some of his best thinking, perambulating the halls of the second floor of the White House late at night when he couldn't sleep, and he was alone. Right? So, and that's true of lots of leaders. So I think that if this book can normalize loneliness for any leader out there, it's accomplished an important objective.
I mentioned before we started that I gave this book to my therapist, and we were talking about it yesterday during my session. And one of the things that he pointed out was there are narcissistic qualities in each of these people. And narcissism has become such this, like, almost a boogeyman phrase for all sorts of reasons. But there are narcissistic pieces in here that actually play well for them as being leaders, right?
Well, I mean, most high achieving, highly successful, right? Highly controlling, that's most of the people in this room, right? People are people who have a healthy slug, maybe healthy is the wrong word, have a real slug of narcissism in their makeup, in their emotional makeup. It's part of what drives people. It's part of what, at times really, really justifies their wanting, more authority or more influence or more fame. So narcissism is a gas tank for most high achieving people. When it becomes a destructive force, as we have seen in certain public examples in our history, that's a different story. But narcissism qua narcissism isn't necessarily a terrible thing. What's interesting to me about these people is that I think it's arguable that all 5 of them, in different ways, different kind of symptoms or manifestations, were driven primarily by what your therapist would call a narcissistic pathology at the beginnings of their journey. Carson wants more than anything to be famous as a writer. Lincoln wants to be a famous politician. Douglass wants to be a famous Black American freedom fighter. But famous is very, very important for Douglass, and he's a master keeper, master manager of his own image. No, by the way, no surprise. He's the most photographed American in the 19th century. It's just a fun fact to know, right? That was not an accident. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is an intellectual wonderkind and wants to be known as the smartest, man at the University of Berlin. So they've all got, Shackleton wants to be the first man to get to the pole. So they've all got this narcissistic kind of gas tank. And what's so interesting about these stories is that when the really difficult stuff, to the points all three of you are making, comes down on them, really the stuff really comes raining down. Somehow, right? I can't precisely reconstruct this. I can't perfectly reconstruct this. That drive stops matter. That gas tank stops mattering quite as much to fueling them. Maybe a lot, stops mattering a lot. And what happens is the cause, end slavery now, transform the American experiment, save the earth and its creatures, get my men home alive, fight Nazi evil with all I have. The cause, the mission takes over. And suddenly their main fuel starts being, what can I do that's good to help achieve this mission that helps other people? None of these missions are about my fame points or my book sales or my votes. So that transformation, what the theologian Martin Buber, German theologian of the earliest 20th century, called the movement or the shift from I to thou, I to we, becomes incredibly empowering. And all of you folks that have discovered these ruby slippers, you understand what a superpower that shift is. It's a superpower.
Jackie, you mentioned having almost naysayers and making sure they're with you, and that was part of the part. Is that hard? It feels like almost in a book, it's easy to read about, but in real life, it's really hard to do, because sometimes, let's be honest, we just say, oh my goodness, this person's just a pain in my butt. and feels like it's slowing, it's not efficient to have to deal. But sometimes that was the thing, I had people when I had to manage people, and it's just a pain, but they caused me to think about what I was doing in a way that was different, that in the end was powerful if I could bring them and make them a part. And that has to be a big challenge in the work that you do every day.
Yeah, it's, I find that the fear of the unknown, the fear of change, is what creates people to react very differently. And so in my experiences, again, finding a mission and driving change and looking at how do we affect change in such a way. And again, a lot of that resonates very well with many of the folks in the book. It's those people that I call the naysayers, that are just so outwardly spoken, and it's their fear that's driving them. And again, really why Shackleton resonated is he took those folks that he saw that were impacting the morale of his team and were driving everyone down because they were bringing them down with them. And I've had a similar experience where we're evolving as an organization, but people are so afraid to evolve, or what's the future hold, that I've had to literally reorganize the group and find where those people could put their energy. And they've been extremely successful in the organization because we found that they could help build, they can help build the organization, build the new process, build the way that we're going to evolve to. And so they felt vested in it, and that really turned things around. And they happened to, help be one of those forces that could help me drive the change that needed to happen in the organization. It was very interesting. And, something that happened within the past year and a half, couple of years to me personally in my leadership journey that I think is why it was such a great, really, it hit home when I saw and read about what Shackleton had done.
Nancy, I always say that people love change as long as we can keep doing things the same way we always have. And that was, all these people, all five of these people are really, their missions are bringing about pretty dramatic change.
Yeah.
And getting people to feel comfortable with that is.
It is, and it begins, let's go back to what Jay said about framing. It begins with kind of helping people realize we must think anew and act anew, right? That that we got to get comfortable with volatility in some sense, right? I mean, how does Rachel Carson organize Silent Spring? She organizes it by saying, look, if we don't do this, here's the world that's coming at us. So it's like, let's shake it up and start thinking very, very differently about our relationship with the both right resilient and very fragile or vulnerable web of life that sustains all of us. So I think that these people help others get comfortable with uncertainty, right? And they also do something else that I didn't say clearly in the book, but now in COVID, in the way I've kind of pulled on my own research from the book for this crisis, they also got comfortable with navigating point to point. So you have the mission, you know what the North Star is, but you can't in such unstable times say, okay, we're plugging it into Waze and here's the little directions that are going to pop out. You go 7 miles on Route 74 and take the second exit. That we got to throw out the old playbook, and we're going to have to do some experimentation, innovation, kind of literally point to point. Lincoln said in 1864, when it was clear, November, he just won re-election, it was clear that Union was going to win the war. He said, I plainly confess I had no grand plan for winning the war. I navigated point to point. And that's the essence of great leadership in times of long crises, crises that aren't a single surgical strike, punctuated disruption. And all these people helped other people do that. And then once you get into that frame, Jay, once you're in that frame, you can say, well, what do I want to do in this crisis? Like, well, how do I want to, am I going to just hunker down and kind of keep my head low and try and satisfy my way through? Or am I going to actually think anew and act anew, raise the level of my game? And I think that's really, really important. We don't see enough of that on our national stage right now, asking Americans to say, this is like the Second World War. It is of that magnitude. So how are we going to rise as a people, united people, to meet the challenges that we all have and the roles we have to play to get COVID under control, for example? So,
Jay, did you want to add something? I saw you kind of sitting at the edge of your seat.
I feel just like I want to connect so many of these points. I mean, the narcissism and the criticism, they feed into a leadership. And to the point around COVID and loneliness, it's not just sufficient. I think it's necessary, the space and gap to reflect. Lincoln created this when he wrote letters he didn't send. I have to imagine Frederick Douglass felt this sense of loneliness when he's away from his family, in England.
Absolutely.
So you need that gap. Shackleton created it with his crew when he'd go in and recite poetry or sing songs, right? So even for the leader as well as the team. And I think the point to point is really critical to that, because you got to keep the steps manageable. And so when we talk in IT, we talk about agile or iterative or whatever the word you want to look. I mean, everyone ended up with an anchor, and frankly, Lincoln's anchors probably shifted the most. His opinion about emancipation.
Yep.
Shackleton literally used an ice anchor to drag the boat sometimes. Frederick Douglass also changed his framing or his anchor around working outside the system versus inside the system. And so that space, which Bonhoeffer had in prison, it was forced on him, if you will, but it also gave him that sense to work. So there's that, it's necessary. So COVID in a way is creating more leaders.
Yeah. I wish you were saying that to Americans, right? We'd like to hear it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, if he was president, he'd be having a fireside chat or chats every week. And one of them would be about, what are we doing in all this, enforced isolation? What are we thinking? How are we making sense of our priorities? How are we considering our role as citizens and neighbors and family members? How are we redefining connection? No one is asking that of us at a national level. And so, left to our own devices, we're not so impressive sometimes. Leaders help people do better, harder things.
Yeah. Jay, I wanted to go back because Jackie mentioned the part about people outside who may think differently. And one of the things about being leaders, and as you mentioned, anchors, is, guess what? Even as a leader, you don't always have all the answers. None of these people had all the answers. They had to have an inner kind of fortitude to be able to say, hey, this is an important direction. And I guess it's going back to that concept of courage to say, hey, this is the direction we're going. Shackleton had to say, yeah, this is how we're going to get out of this. Yeah. And he may have been wrong. And the story that was written was how all these people died. But he had this faith in himself, I guess. It's kind of, again, pulling those threads together. But I know you face this every day. When you're doing cloud stuff, we don't know the answers. No, there's no ways, as Nancy mentioned. You don't know. You're doing the best you can, right?
Yeah, it's really hard. And where do you put your faith in, right? There is no I in team. And to first be a team leader, you have to have a team. You have to create that space, whatever form that happens. And, you know, the one that sort of spoke to me in terms of confusion is Lincoln struggling with his Army of the Potomac. Get off your guns, get, you know, and eventually eventually being a very long time replaces that leader. You know, you have to be able to delegate. I also love the story of Lincoln where he can work the cornfields. You know, he helped harvest grain, and Shackleton helped do menial tasks. I mean, you know, they scrub the deck on the ship. As a leader, you have to be able to roll up your sleeves and create the bonds, and the bonds build the team. And if somebody doesn't want to be on the team, like, that's an honest conversation between the leader. But I've really felt for Lincoln trying to, you know, how long do you coach versus when do you kind of
you know, that's such a great pull out. He had to get his courage grew through the war, right? I mean, you're absolutely right, Chris. It's like, how do you tap into the well of faith, self-belief? And what happened is, I think he got the chain holding the bucket to that well got more lubricated, and he got faster and better at filling it up and getting it right up to the top quickly over the course of the war. So that when Grant emerged right onto the national consciousness from the West in the Western battlefields of the Civil War, he goes, I can't spare that man, he fights, you know. Or when someone said, you know, Grant drinks too much, he said, can we just give a pint of that whiskey to everyone in the Army of the Potomac? We're going to win a lot more battles. So he could then recognize that that was his man, and actually, for the first time in the war, turn over a lot of military strategy to Grant and Sherman and some other folks that would come along in their wake. But like Phil Sheridan. But in any event, I want to say two things to what you both just said, Chris, and I know you know a great deal about this, Jackie, as well, Chris and Jay. So each of these people doubted themselves because particularly as we all understand, when the situation became dire, or, you know, something just happened that was so debilitating or such a setback. So first thing to say is, one of the interesting lessons from the book is great leaders have moments of grave doubts and get close to what I call the cliff of despair. And, you know, I think I'll just dive off and give up because it's too hard. Everyone gets close there. So don't think that because you've been there, that doesn't mean you're not a great leader. That means you are a great leader. The question isn't, do you get close? The question is, do you dive over? And all of these people get right up to the edge with their toes curled right over the rock face, and then something, and I'll tell you what I think it is, each stops each of them at each of these moments, and they take a baby step back, and then another step back, and they're ready. This usually happens late at night when we're not sleeping, and so, you know, those dark nights of the soul moments, and they're ready for the next day to walk into the fear. So grave doubts, particularly with big worthy missions, are part of the territory, just like loneliness. The question isn't, do you have them? The question is, can you find something that causes you to back away from the edge of giving up? Because if you give up, the game's up. And what they found over and over again, I think, is the sense that if I give up now, the game will be either seriously compromised or lost. And the game, freeing the slaves, over and over for Douglass, fighting Hitler, over and over for Bonhoeffer, finishing Silent Spring, and with an impact she knew would be very, very great in terms of what would happen to environmental sustainability for Carson. At each moment, the mission, the vow, we're doing this for a big worthy purpose, becomes like something that's like a guardrail at the edge of the Grand Canyon. It pushes them back away from the edge. And then a sense that this is my work, this is who I am, and this is too important, even though it's really hard. And so they start again. So courage isn't not having doubts, and courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the willingness to take another step back into the fear, right? And realize that you're still standing, your core is tight, your shoulders are back. And by the way, when you look around you, other people are taking that step right behind you because you're taking a step. That's what
that gut check moment, right? Those are the moments where you go, okay, we got to dig deep here and figure out the path forward.
It's all about digging deep. And then, by the way, the next time you don't necessarily have to dig quite as deep, because you're like, oh God, I remember 6 months ago when I was just gonna hang it all up. Resilience, muscle gets stronger each time.
Jackie, I want to, because I think I always tell my 9-year-old, you know, courage doesn't mean that you're not scared. It means that you dig deep, you figure out how you're going to process on that fear and still move forward. And I have to imagine, as a leader in your position, it has to be, there are these moments where you just go, oh my God, if I mess this up, and we all know in government what happens if you mess up. It's not fun, right? Particularly nowadays. And that is real courage. And at least I kept coming through with all these people like, oh my goodness, that's courage.
Yeah, you know, we see moments, and you've got to not be afraid to take a risk and to take a chance, because the payoff is, you know, and the benefit of being able to accomplish your mission and your goal is, you know, bigger and better, more rewarding than actually letting the opportunity pass you by. And you're right, Chris, it's the scrutiny, it's, you know, so many eyes, and people are just waiting for you, especially as a government official, taking the wrong step to be able to criticize the administration. And you know, it's interesting because I really enjoyed the part of the book about when Douglass was contemplating going back to Massachusetts, and being afraid that his Maryland slave owner was going to somehow come in and get him because he had escaped. And you know, that was significant courage, right? He could have stayed overseas in England and been safe and still helped his cause in abolishing slavery, even with his wife and his 4 children back in Massachusetts. But he took that risk, and it paid off in spades. And, you know, even in building his cause out there, you know, building those folks in the coalition behind him to be able to pay the money to free him as a slave, and building that it was huge. Building your coalitions.
Yeah, that's right.
And so he built up his cause. And it's so, you know, you find parallels in the government. You've got to build up your coalitions and get people behind you. So even if you do misstep or you falter, people still know and respect and trust you and know where you're trying to go. And I found that really big with what he had done.
Yeah, that's a great, again, so well read. Everywhere he went, he built his coalition. That's right.
And you're not alone. You're just not alone in this.
Right.
Jake, talk about a little bit, because one of the other threads that I think spoke to the work that government faces is the failure. And we talked earlier about Frederick Douglass and how many times he approached failure and had to just, you know, brush himself off and say, okay, I got to get back to this because this mission is so important. And I've been doing this for a long time. I always joke that, you know, I've been doing this since Abraham Lincoln was around. And they still have problems with IT. And they, all of them had to pick themselves up. You have to do that every day, don't you?
Yeah, I think failure isn't, I mean, you know, there's this myth of that leaders have all the answers. And we see in the book, every leader goes through this journey of learning. And, you know, so it's not fail fast, it's learn fast, right? And I think the coalition building is part of how you learn, and you build kind of your early warning detection system, or your circle of trust, or your mastermind, you know, whatever the right phrase is there. I think leaders fundamentally create other leaders. And we saw that with Sherman and you know, all of the stuff that we saw in the Civil War, right? That they didn't usurp Lincoln in terms of his leadership. In fact, they amplified it. Shackleton had, like, I don't know, 8 or 9 men come from the first, you know, expedition that had failed to the second. And I have to imagine they helped him greatly when he led that. And so I think failure is, you know, it's almost looked down, or we try and gloss it over with Silicon Valley lead speak of, you know, fail fast. But it's really this thing about, you have to learn it, but you can't just learn it for yourself. You have to share it with the community and the coalition that Jackie talked about.
Professor, as you were writing this, were there things that you pulled on about how leaders deal with failure? Because it's hard.
So I think that's the reason I wrote the book. I didn't know it at the time. So I started working on Shackleton I wrote an Harvard Business School case. I'm a historian. I'm very, very unusual. I don't look like any other professors at the Harvard Business School because I study history and give it to people that are action-oriented for today to see what lessons they can learn from the rhymes of the past. I was working on this case on Shackleton in 2001 and 2002. And then a bunch of things happened to me really in short succession, crises. My father dropped dead. He was 72, very healthy, very energetic. Just dropped dead at the kitchen table one day. My mother collapsed because she was so dependent on his strength. My husband of 14 years left. My ex-husband walked out about 4 months later and said, I don't love you anymore. I'm going to get all your Harvard retirement. And then I got cancer. And that all happened in a very short span of time. And then I got cancer again. And then I had to find a lawyer that could protect me, which was very hard. I didn't no-fault divorce state when the woman makes all the money and the husband's not successful professionally. And you want to talk about failure. It was just one life-changing failure after another. And so I think I got interested in Lincoln because I wanted to learn how people can deal with failure, how they recover from it, how they learn from it, how they, most important, how they grow from it, how they grow. And Lincoln, and then Douglass, and then Bonhoeffer, and then Carson, and Shackleton taught. The whole story is a story of failure. I mean, he's responsible in some small or medium-sized way for the initial reason they get stuck in the ice. That's another longer story, but it was all about failure. This book is all about being forged in crisis. Some of the crises you can see, some of the crises are about failure.
Yeah.
So I wrote the book to help me get better and bigger as the big hunky blocks of my life, including my job, because I was on a fast track administratively at the Harvard Business School. When you get cancer and your husband walks out in the same year, they take you right off that fast track. Not really right. And then I got cancer again. They're like, sign Nancy away for just research, right? As it turned out, that was fine. I got to write the book. I never would have written the book if I was an assistant dean. But that's my point. How can I grow? How can I make something that's not bitter, not smaller, and not more brittle, and not more angry, but instead more expansive, more useful for the rest of the world, more, luminous within myself? How can I grow? Because I have experienced this searing failure. That is the essence of the book. Yeah. And crises are all about failure, my friends. They're about failure. They're about the failure of, weather systems to deal with a tornado. They're about
there you go. The dogs agree.
They're about the failure of our public health system and lots of other systems to, kind of adequately get ahead of the pandemic. They're about, all crises are about failure. 3 Mile Island is about failure in systems and a failure to perceive that what was happening at that nuclear power plant was truly novel. So really interesting, important issue, and is also the source of our biggest growth and our biggest potential.
I'm going to ask you one last question, then ask each of you for final thoughts of your big takeaways from both this discussion and also the book. But Nancy, before I do that, it's a little bit chicken and the egg question. Did the crisis make the leader, or does the leader not make the crisis? But do they? It's
both. It's a great question. Yeah. It's both. It's the man is made by the moment, and the man or the woman in turn make the moment. Right? Yeah. It's this really interesting synergy between, the effects on the individual and then how that individual is able, in the face of great historical forces. COVID is bigger than any single person or any even single body, right? How the individual in that moment can mobilize others to do harder, better things, to really do something very positive and benevolent and affirming in the face of a force that's larger than any individual. But the person and the moment affect each other.
Yeah. Jay, we have a couple minutes left. So give us your takeaways. What do you, for somebody who may not have read the book, or give us your sense as to what you read this because I asked you to. What'd you take away?
I think the importance of humility and perspective, and it goes to this point of failure. Like we're going to have failures, and I think, Chris, your question around what does government choose to do with the failures? Nassim Taleb, the author of a couple books, right, The Black Swan and so forth, but he talks about the difference between robust and he calls it anti-fragile, the tendency with failure is to like glom on more and more controls. And so we end up sort of ossifying, and all of these leaders like kept their perspective and their sort of fluidity in the moment. They didn't lose their anchors and their principles or whatever they believed in, but they, you know, Lincoln still laid on the floor in the White House with kids, you know, like Rachel was still able to walk the beach and appreciate a butterfly whose lifespan was like months, and she applied it to her own life, right? So they, you know, they took this sense of failure, but they didn't allow it to cocoon themselves in fear. And I think that that was the growth that ultimately happened. And so it was a remarkable read for me to kind of read about the growth that they all went through. And I mean, just Professor, I appreciate the book, and Chris, thanks for making me read it.
Thank
Jack?
you.
Yeah, thank you. Jackie?
You know, I would echo what Jay said, but one of the things that also resonated and held true was no matter the failure, no matter the obstacles, they never lost sight of their overarching mission and objectives and the, you know, the longer term goal. There was a lot of detours in the way, if you will, and each one of them held true to what they were trying to accomplish. And you know, it was very interesting and profound that I found with Rachel Carson especially. One of the points that was made in the book is that, you know, here she is, she's facing, well, she was misdiagnosed with cancer, then she got the cancer diagnosis, and she had to take care of her great nephew because she had adopted him because he was orphaned. And here she is facing her own mortality, and she realized that you can't take on everything, you've got to prioritize. And her priority and what she really took on was making sure that she could get Silent Spring out and published and finished, because that was her priority. And as leaders, you know, you have to prioritize. You can't do it all at once. And what is the priority that's going to help you reach that mission and that objective? But that really, it was very interesting and touching.
That's a great,
thank you.
Thank you. That was a great, just say no, right? It's not
right.
Say no to the less important stuff so you can say yes to only what you can do to achieve a worthy mission. So important right now.
I'm going to finish off with my two. One is ending where you started, which was that David Foster Wallace quote on, you know, leaders are people who can help us overcome the limitations of our own individual laziness, selfishness, and weakness, and get us to do better, faster, harder, things that we couldn't do otherwise. So I love that, and just the power of courage. And I think the reason I selected this book is I feel like people feel disempowered right now. And I know when I read this book 3 years ago, and when I've read it again, it helps you dig deep and say, hey, I can do this, we can do this, and create that bond with other folks. Nancy, leave folks with, as they have the survey up, but leave folks with final thought. What are you hoping?
My final thought is just building on what you just said. I want to just thank Jay and Jackie for your eloquent and trenchant comments and readings, pullaways from the book. It means a great deal to me. I won't forget it. It'll make my afternoon and more. So I just want to leave you with this. This is the COVID crisis and the crises that it has unleashed. Not that they were solely, the economic downturn is about COVID, but the campaign for justice and equality has been long delayed, long delayed, right? Justice delayed too long is justice denied. This is here, and it needs to be here. But COVID really, COVID was part of the kindling, along with Mr. Floyd's murder, that set that crisis afire. These crises are seismic events, particularly the pandemic, right? This is akin to World War II. This isn't akin to even Katrina and some of these other, you know, terrible natural disasters our country's experienced, our world's experienced. So that means when you have a crisis that's a seismic event, that the world is being remade as we speak into the post-COVID world, not the new normal, not back to normal, the post-COVID world. And in that context, leaders forged, right, in such turbulence could not be more important. So I don't think the world is telling you enough about how important you are and how this is your moment to rise and be even better. And this is a moment when the world needs every ounce, right, every fiber of your good leadership and your dedication and your courage, your willingness to walk into the fear and your commitment more than it has ever needed it before. And perhaps if we do our job well, more than it will need it again. This is one of those moments.
Yeah.
So Godspeed. This is your moment, and we need you.
Professor Nancy Koehn with the Harvard Business School, author of Forged in Crisis, The Making of 5 Courageous Leaders. Highly recommended if you haven't read it. If you did, I hope you got as much of it as I did, and I think our group did. Also, Jackie Rubino, AFFIRM President and Executive Director of the Strategic Programs Division at the Department of Homeland Security, and Jay Huey, of the Chief Information Officer at the DC Office of State Superintendent of Education. Jay, Jackie, Nancy, thank you so much for doing this. Deeply appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. We have a bunch of AFFIRM events coming up. Don't forget, check affirm.org to find how COVID shattered the myths of government management, FITARA, Cybersecurity Summit, all of them coming up, affirm.org. Thank you guys all for being here. Thank you guys for doing this. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Nancy. Excellent book. Really enjoyed it.
Jackie. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Christopher. Really enjoyed it. Bye now.